Hello, everybody. Welcome to Fear and Loving with Ranch. This is episode 10. How to Change Cultural Institutions, March 9th, 2021. I am your host, Ranch, and looking forward to diving in with the team here. All right, so we are joined by Kat Wells, Chris Foltz, and Joe Nice tonight. We are sadly missing Rue Johnson. Shout out to Rue Johnson. Unable to join us tonight due to some prior obligations. But gonna let the team here introduce themselves. We'll start with you, Kat.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me again. I guess I will start with the fact that I am a sociologist. I identify as a queer intersectional feminist. I'm a social justice advocate, an environmentalist, and an abolitionist, all of the things. I want to, allow for people who are the most marginalized to have a better life. So that's me. That's what I advocate for.
Love it. Thank you so much for that work. And we'll go with Joe.
What's up, everybody? It's me. I'm Joe Nice. People know me as a DJ. Played a few shows, traveled around the world, been a few places, sold a few records, played a few parties here and there. Now more than ever, I am slightly less interested in flinging dope plates and flying first class around the world. And I'm far more interested in what is on my t-shirt right now. I'm going to show you all, everybody, what's happening here. Humanity, freedom, equality, and survival. These are the 4 fights that everybody is dealing with right now. I'm far more interested in making sure that the most marginalized, as my sister Kat just said earlier, the most marginalized have an opportunity, and not just an opportunity, or have their human rights ensured through these 4 lenses of humanity, freedom, equality, and survival. A couple of other things before we turn this over to Chris. Number 1, I'm wearing a yellow vest. In French, the gilet jaune. I'm in full support of workers' rights in France, in Belgium, Italy, and any other country that is having issues with governments continually marginalizing the working class of the world. And I want to show everybody this. I bought this button today. This is a button saying "Justice for George." That is George Floyd. The Derek Chauvin trial in Minneapolis, Minnesota began on Monday, yesterday, March 8th. The jury selection is supposed to take about a week. We want justice for George Floyd. We want justice for anybody who has been a victim of police genocide and racial discrimination as a result of law enforcement, whether it's George Floyd, whether it's Walter Wallace, whether it's Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Jonathan Price. The list unfortunately goes on. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to, obviously, another robust discussion with my people here in this space.
It's pretty wild how we can just watch that Chauvin trial live on Facebook, the whole damn thing. And I watched a few minutes, and the judge was speaking, and it was just it was a lot for me. But
it feels like the OJ trial all over again.
Right. All right, Christopher Foltz.
I don't even know how to follow that. I don't have any fancy ist. You've got tons of ist, Kat. You're an ist and everything. Yeah. Joe, I mean, it's like you're walking embodiment of movement, which I just appreciate in a dramatic way. I guess my scenario is this. I'm Chris Foltz. I guess I work in marketing by trade, but, I represent a fantastic magazine, Sensi, and the media group that we have there. But, to give it a short synopsis, I was a Republican strategist. I ended up being a heroin addict, homeless. When you go to jail as a Republican strategist, you come out a Democrat. So then I became a Democratic strategist, and I realized no party is the way to go. And through all the things I've learned, I have a weird perspective on things, mainly because I've done everything wrong before I did anything right. So I appreciate the conversation with people, and the perspectives I gain from this show is remarkable. So for all the people that are listening in, one thing I can assure you is, you know, we don't plan to agree. We don't try to disagree. And where most people in society focus all their time on telling the world what makes them different, right here, we focus on what makes us the same. So I really appreciate being part of all this, and thank you for making it possible, Ranch.
Thank you guys. So, you know, just having fun with my friends here and looking to learn like every time we meet, you know. And I did want to kind of, you know, I'm Ranch, and I've established Fear and Loving last year, and I'm also a part of Sensi Media Group, Sensi Magazine, and also a part of Decriminalized Nature Massachusetts. And you know, the mission of Fear and Loving is, you know, we were established during 2020's COVID-19 pandemic as a platform to bring together voices who believe in the essential impact of Gonzo journalism and who fight for truth and justice from a compassionate heart center. The platform is a strong focus on anti-corruption, compassionate policy changes, as well as a fight for social justice and equality. This show here, Fear and Loving with Ranch, is our flagship online variety show hosted by myself and the team here, streaming and syndicated across YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch. Please go follow us on YouTube. We are in that stage where we need subscribers so we can make it easier to find us. And yeah, during the 2020 Revolution, the program is featured and 2021 Revolution now. I mean, it's warming up. We'll see what goes down in the streets this year. But, you know, we bring a diverse group of guests around these topics of social justice and anti-racism. And today, ready to go. Let's do this. So how to change cultural institutions. We've all met a couple times to kind of chew on this. And, you know, we want to see if we could determine like how to make a lasting and impactful cultural changes in the institutions that we have in this country, across the world. You know, I was talking to our producer, Jake, and, you know, he was throwing around the idea of the perversion of institutions. And I do think that that's what we have experienced. And that, you know, that is when we need to see this change occur, when there is a perversion happening. And I think we're going to talk a little more about that. So, you know, when you think of an institution or of a complex, and we'll throw that word in there too. Everybody's heard of, you know, military industrial complex, you know, criminal justice complex. I think so. You know, let's have everybody kind of just real quick, like what comes to mind, Chris?
Bureaucracy, you know, bureaucratic process, red tape, slowing things down, change. The only thing more scary to change the organization is the actual adoption of the change that they voted in the board meeting. You know, so for me, institution represents a long-standing institution that, you know, a plausible alternative to the reality is always fresh. You know, so that's what I think about it right away. Bureaucracy.
All right. Kat?
Yeah, I think of something really similar. I come from sort of several years of being sort of in the institution of a university and sort of the ivory tower of that environment, and how bureaucratic it is, and how, I mean, it's just sort of it's like an old boys club of like these, you know, intellectual white men that are, you know, the gatekeepers of, you know, education and intellect and interesting conversations, and that's not okay. And so, yeah, I want to dismantle that and abolish it if I can, because, you know, these conversations should be accessible and for everyone.
Well, again, I agree with you, Kat, as usual.
Always interesting perspectives,
yeah,
right? That is fantastic.
I'm never like, is Kat gonna like be able to articulate this well, you know? Kicking ass.
I'm scared, right? Like, I don't know how to, you know, reply to some of the logic, right? It's intense, but it's cool.
What you got for us, show? I like the vest.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate that. When I think of institutions, I think of relationships. I think of relationships, and I think of relationships in the context of the connection between human beings. Kat, you so eloquently said a couple of minutes ago about the institution of higher education. There, and again, there is a context, and when you're dealing with an old white guy that's got a PhD with tenure and you're a student working on a master's degree, there's a clear power dynamic between you and that professor. When you think about the institution of marriage. Marriage is an institution. It is a relationship. It is a relationship based on love. And certainly we know about this regarding the Fear and Loving podcast. It is also a relationship built on a physical connection and a mental connection and a spiritual connection. So these are just examples of what I think institutions are. Institutions are relationships that in context are relative to culture and in context relative to each individual's life, particular and exclusive life situation.
That sounds so much better than my bureaucracy statement. So kudos to that, Joe.
Hey, whatever comes to mind, for me, I'll talk about complex, and I'm 32, 9/11, 2001. I was already fired up about U.S. politics and government. That's kind of the classes I liked. And so, to watch that come to fruition over those few years. And then the film Why We Fight came out in 2005. I saw that in theaters, kind of stuff my dad would take me to, and really blew my mind about the military industrial complex. So, it's really dug in. Like when I think of complex in this context, I think of that film, and I think of that one particularly because, man, it's a tough one. But we're gonna do. This is the best part. This is my favorite time. It's definition time, everybody. So we're gonna do some definitions here. We're gonna define institution and complex. So it's a little stale. I didn't write these definitions. If they did, they'd be.
This is exciting.
Awesome.
Can't wait to hear it.
Okay, so here we go. This is my old friend Merriam-Webster. So institution, an established organization or corporation, especially a public character, a group or system of different entities that share connected in a close or complicated manner, a worry or concern about a particular characteristic, example, guilt complex, inferiority. I think I got that one mixed up. Sorry, that's supposed to go with complex. Oops. So definition of complex, composed of many interconnected parts, an intricate or complicated association or assemblage of related things, an institution that controls the behavior of people in or around it. That last one is like in the book.
Yeah, it's in there.
Makes your skin crawl a little bit, and it's just like dun 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 dun.
Did they close with that? That's the last one. They didn't put a sandwich there. They put a nicer one after that.
No, but it makes me think like why is it a dirty word? And I think profit driven, reinforcing inequalities. Those are a couple of like kind of maybe I'm missing something. There's Complex Magazine. I don't know. Maybe there's some complexes that are not that, but I think in the context of what we're talking about here, that's what comes to mind. But
I think I actually, when I look at my definition versus the other two that were laid out initially, Kat drew attention to what would be some systemic problems, like actual challenges that the institution has created over time, where I'm looking at this kind of like generalist bureaucracy statement. Now, for me, I've got major respect for institutions, and to me, complex can be good or bad. But the reason why I have respect for institution is kind of jaded. In every relationship I had institutionally. I mean, I've been in the justice system, the penal system, in jail. I've been involved in higher education. All these different things, and I've always been somewhat let down by institution. But somehow I've kept this, almost like nostalgic. Fanboy scenario around institutions. And I think it's because what it means if you make change in them. If you make change in an institution, I'd say that, I spent my entire life trying to rescue kittens, but in institutions like a cat shelter. So if you make change in an institution, the echo, the butterfly effect seems so much more vast. And I think that there may be a pathway there. Even when Joe found this kind of positive way to frame up, at least an analogy standpoint, that I didn't even think about.
Right. And it did, as right as you were getting started there, I kind of did a lot of bashing on institutions and complexes, but I mean, where would we be without them? And so it's like, I'm very thankful that these institutions exist, especially in this country, United States of America, but it's been, that feeling of being let down. We grow up to believe in their possibility and how amazing they have been for this society, and we expect a lot more than I think we're seeing, at least in terms of this change, right? So, Joe, I don't know if you're feeling ready to kind of break down the 7 basic institutions. Oh, looks like you're on mute.
It's not good.
Boom.
All right, I'm unmuted
Got you.
now. I'm unleashed. There are, as we talked about in our group meetings that we have every once in a while to prepare for these conversations, we determined that there are 7 basic institutions that everybody can generally agree on. The 7 basic institutions that everybody can generally agree on are government, family, economy, education, religion, healthcare, and media. I'm going to say them again in case anybody in the chat wants to take notes. The 7 basic institutions, once again: government, family, economy, education, religion, healthcare, and media. And the reason why government is first on the list is because every country or every nation or every municipality has a government which is made up of the citizenry, the people. When the Constitution was written, the preamble of the Constitution of the United States Constitution, the first 3 words are "we the people." And the Constitution is, as I said in the previous conversation, the software, the operating system that controls the levers of power of the 3 branches of government. So we talk about institutions. Government is first, and government plays a big role in the remaining 6 institutions that I've outlined: family, economy, education, religion, healthcare, and media. Now, everybody, if you don't mind me going in a slightly different direction and drawing a parallel to something that I might have mentioned or something that we've heard in public. Every once in a while, you'll hear the media discussed as the 4th estate. You'll hear that thrown around every once in a while. Or, as we've seen over this past weekend, the controversy, or in my opinion, not so controversial comments made by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle about the British royal family. And you've heard the words "the 2nd estate." But where do these come from? There are actually 5 estates. The 5 estates are: the first estate is clergy, the 2nd estate is nobility, the 3rd estate are the commoners, the 4th estate is the media, and the 5th estate, which is a relatively new formed estate, blogs, social media, and or the internet. Now, there is a theologian named John Wycliffe, and he wrote a book called In Works, and he wrote this book in the year 1380. And he said that he declared that 3 estates were ordained by God. The 3 estates that were ordained by God were clergy, nobility, and commoners. And given his religious perspective, he determined that the first estate should be the clergy, people of the cloth, religious people who practice and believe in some sort of religion. The 2nd estate should be barons and knights, otherwise known as nobility. And the 3rd estate, or the commoners, were the last on the list at that time. So when you think about John Wycliffe's book that was written in 1380, where he discusses back then the 3 estates, which is now expanded to 5, and the 7 basic institutions that we've outlined: government, family, economy, education, religion, healthcare, and media. Clearly, there are parallels between the 5 estates and the 7 basic institutions.
Well, I think that's an interesting comparison. What would you say is the most direct comparison between them? Is it a caste system that's attached to all of them? What's the unifying factor here?
I think the basic unifying factor is something that you said in one of your comments, and Reg, you might have mentioned it also. It's control. It's control. It's some form of using a small group of people to control the masses. Think about what Karl Marx said in the Communist Manifesto when he said that religion is an opiate of the masses, where you can use religion to control people. And if you look at every single religion, or most religions out there, whether you're Jewish, whether you're Buddhist, whether you're Sunni, whether you're Shiite, Catholic, Christian, whatever religious, Hindu, whatever you practice, the basic fundamental tenets of religion are all the same. Basically, treat people right, don't be a jerk, and treat people with respect. That's basically what all religions are about. But how you interpret those religions and how people in positions of power, specifically people in positions of power within those religious institutions, especially when you deal with Christianity, it's obviously a white male perspective with regards to the control of the institution of religion. It plays a major role in how people live their day-to-day lives. And take a look at the 5 estates. Clergy was first. It wasn't nobility. It wasn't the commoners. Let's take this in a different perspective. Think about how powerful of an individual the Pope is. But the Pope is not the Queen of England. The Pope is not Rupert Murdoch. The Pope is not Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey. The Pope is not any of us here. The Pope is the head of an institution known as Christianity and Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that holds a lot of power. When the Pope decides to go somewhere, people follow him. People pay attention. People listen to what the Pope has to say. And as a result, there is a certain level of control within that institution of Catholicism and globally as the Pope makes his moves around the world.
So I think it's almost a false control, though, right? Growing up a Catholic in my entire life, involved in the church, I think that it's a reverence out of fear. But I would also say this, you have some of the most indoctrinated people in the church that commit some of the most heinous sins, right? So the institution in its own right, I would argue, I guess my question's for Kat, from a sociology perspective, looking at these estates, is it in a different order in modern day times? Or does that institutional structure of the clergy being first, nobility being second, apply to modern day society the same that it did in the past?
I mean, I think that it's shifted, but it is still sort of just a similar structure. What I would want to bring into this conversation is the fact that we are all living in settler colonial states. We're in North America. I'm in Canada. You all are in the United States of America. Our government systems were set up based on the British system for the most part. And what was really, embedded in that was religion, Christianity particularly. So our laws are all based within Christianity. And so it might look different because a lot of us don't really remember, the government being the church, because we have laws that say like we should have separation of church and state.
Well, smoke and mirrors, right?
But I would
pushed
argue
it out almost and took over.
Yeah, and I mean, government is that out of those 7 basic that we mentioned. I mean, it's the big kahuna, it's the big one, and it's the one that if we want to see change in any of these other institutions culturally across our land, then we need to see some upgrades to the government as an institution. And there have not been many big upgrades to our government, really, especially as of late. But there had definitely, it's kind of like untouchable, the idea of where religion and government intersect, especially in the United States of America, and maybe particularly Christianity and government. I also was raised Catholic. I also am just, I really appreciate all spiritual traditions and their ability to really help us get through this life as humans. And there's so much beauty in Christianity, and that's what I like to remember. Unfortunately, a lot of the social issues, a lot of these debates and these arguments and the fights that are happening in the streets and the pain that people are enduring, you can kind of trace it back to that stranglehold and how they don't want things to change in this country in terms of our government institution, in terms of their bottom line, unfortunately, because it's such a business these days, or just generally their values. And so that permeates throughout all the other institutions, economy, education, healthcare, social. It's a thing. So,
I got a question, Richard. I know you push for the idea of the government stepping up and funding things, like whether it be healthcare, education, understandably. Canada does this and successfully in many different capacities. But if the institution that's at the helm, why would we shift all the money to what I would consider to be one of the more questionable institutional structures, the government, to be the supplier and implementer of all of those other institutions that also require some change, like education?
I guess I think looking back, I was a little, hopeful, like, I don't know, starry-eyed to believe that the government could be better, quicker, fast. Especially by, my generation. I just would like to see things. I want to visualize it being different, but we're seeing so much of it persist. So, in relation to that, I think that, I could see us trying something else other than what Bernie and myself and everybody's pushing for. All I care about is people having access to healthcare, all people. So can we get that done without bringing it further into government? The answer, sure, let's try. I don't know, but I'm going to pause it there. We should pick that question back up, but we're going to take a break from the conversation. We're going to bring it back real quick. We're going to introduce Kevin Matthews, our guest for this week. So give me just a second here. Oh, there he is.
Kevin Matthews, you look cool and everything, man. Good stuff. Hat.
It's necessary. It's requirement to be a guest.
It's always an evolving wardrobe. I've got to kind of be a chameleon and navigate between, like our local communities and our lawmakers. So it's just always every day is kind of a guessing game sometimes.
You need camouflage, man. We'll get you some good camouflage. Only way you can make it through that.
It will go well with Joe's fluorescent vest.
I love it. Yeah, I
kind of need one.
This transhumanist future to press a button and switch my wardrobe on the fly would be,
man, that'd be nice.
Yeah.
So Kevin Matthews, personally, I've been a part of Decriminalize Nature Massachusetts, Decriminalize Nature, the organization, and then for about over a year. But prior to that, I linked up with you in Denver while I was living there in regards to the Decriminalize Denver initiative for decriminalizing psilocybin. So, Kevin Matthews of Helix Consulting Group, new lobbying and public affairs organization focused on building a bridge between the people and lawmakers to create equitable and accessible psychedelic policy reform. So, we met in 2018, 2019, while you were campaign director of Decriminalize Denver, the organization that successfully passed the first ballot initiative to decriminalize psilocybin-containing mushrooms in the city of Denver. You went on to establish the Denver Psilocybin Mushroom Policy Review Panel, and you're founder of SPORE, the Society for Psychedelic Outreach, Reform, and Education. SPORE is a nonprofit working to develop educational initiatives to help communities to responsibly integrate psychedelics into the society. Very important. A lot of buzzy, decriminalized things happening, but we got to integrate that. And that's
how are we not friends? This is amazing. We are now. Someone I want to hang out with.
Yeah, and the war on drugs represents the perversion of institutions in our society, with the few profiting from it and damaging the rest of the society. Really, it's pretty undeniable. So, decriminalization of substances, plants, and fungi is an example of institutions changing. So that's why we got you here today. I figured I'd ask you a few questions. So maybe you could start off by telling us about your work today and Helix.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, and it's great to be here. I just love being able to talk about this. So with my work with Helix Consulting Group, when I transitioned away from my role at SPORE and decided to get into professional full-time advocacy and lobbying, the challenge that I had was like, how can I be an effective bridge between our psychedelic community, the psychedelic constituency that's rapidly growing across the country, to our lawmakers. And so really message the needs and wants and desires of this growing constituency to our lawmakers. And then in that way, start to craft legislation that makes sense really makes sense for the people. Coming from the grassroots advocacy side, for me, at least in the work that I'm doing, I have a focus on decriminalization first, and racial and health equity, and just making sure that any kind of reform that's passed, at least here in the state of Colorado, is representative and really puts our communities first.
That's fantastic.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
You're muted, Rich.
Oh, that's got to be the first time. 10 episodes. I don't know if I've ever been muted on the air. I feel like invigorated. I'm going to do it again. No, I'm just kidding. So how did you come to get involved with the decriminalize movement and this kind of policy work with psychedelics?
Yeah. Well, I was a cadet at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. I was there for about 3 years. My whole childhood dream and life dream was to serve my country as a U.S. Army officer. And when I was at West Point, I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. And so that whole life dream crumbled beneath my feet and slipped through my fingertips, right? And then I ended up getting an honorable discharge. I'm actually retired from the U.S. Army, and struggled for a lot of years with depression. Traditional pharmaceuticals weren't really helping. They weren't making anything worse, but they weren't making anything better. They were really just numbing my experience of life. And from that place, I decided to go down the path of personal growth and diving deep into spirituality, which eventually led me to, exploring shamanism from the perspective of a lot of different cultures, which then led to me having an experience with psilocybin mushrooms about a decade ago with a group of friends. And what would be considered, looking from the outside in, a recreational experience actually ended up being one of the most therapeutic and transformative experiences of my life. And so psilocybin having catalyzed a shift in perspective, where I went from all this negative self-talk and a lot of this victim mindset because of the circumstances of my life, really almost switched overnight. It's like my neurons were scrubbed clean, and I was given a new lease on the way that I approach myself and approach my life, and especially how I interact with other people. And then, that experience also, it was in community. It was with a group of friends, and I almost can't separate the community part of it from the actual experience itself, because it all blended together to create this really novel life-changing moment for me. And then from there, I learned about the work that MAPS was doing a couple years later with MDMA, treating veterans with PTSD. And then fast forward again a few years later, I actually listened to Paul Stamets on the Joe Rogan podcast. And at that time, there was a California campaign. I don't know if anyone remembers, Rich, back in 2017, there was a campaign statewide in California, which was talked about briefly on the Rogan interview with Paul Stamets. But it was this moment when Paul was talking about the biological relationship between humans and fungi, and we share half of our DNA with fungi. And the moment where Paul was mentioning, he was like, our humans have a fungal biome. Our gut is a fungal biome. And then he said, congratulations, Joe, to Joe Rogan. He said, congratulations, Joe. Now that we've had this personal interaction with each other, you are now a vector of Paul Stamets.
Okay. Yeah. No, they're in I mean, it's a part of us all. Amazingly.
Right.
Yeah.
That just opened me up, man. Yeah.
It's easy for me to associate with the mycelium, a little more so than humans sometimes, and honestly, like your story really, it's unique to you, but I have a similar story, and so do many on this show. And I think so many that I've met in this movement, and it's something that I needed, because I, in relation to other movements trying to topple institutions, you don't find a whole lot of success stories necessarily. Like, it's hard to get nuggets of positivity, but whenever I hear people answer that question, ultimately, that are a part of this decriminalization movement of substances against the war on drugs in this country, everybody has so many years. It's a story of triumph, and I need that personally to keep working. I'm sure we all do as well. So yeah, I appreciate that, man. And finally, like, how do you see the movement changing cultural institutions in relation to the topic?
I mean, I think the psychedelic revolution, and it's not a renaissance yet. It's not pretty enough to be a renaissance. It's a revolution right now. I think it's going to revolutionize almost every single, if not every single one of those cultural institutions that Joe was mentioning earlier. And there's a quote that I love by Buckminster Fuller, which is, the quote is,
Chris loves Buckminster.
Nice. You'll be familiar with this, Chris. So it's the quote is, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And if we look at the way, it's going to come back to the screen here. I mean, to me, first of all, this movement is expanding, I think, more quickly than any of us could have imagined. I'm not going to Monday morning quarterback it. Like, we went from Denver to Oakland a couple weeks later, to 4 cities, 1 state, and now 12 states in the U.S. with some kind of psilocybin reform. I mean, that's
how change works, right?
It's mycelial, and this movement has a mind of its own. And in so many ways, the only thing I can do is strap on for the ride, because I think there's a certain level of balance here between those of us who are doing like the grassroots and advocacy work to really steward this movement in an appropriate way that benefits the most people possible, while knowing that I think the movement has a mind of its own, and we're going through this rite of passage right now globally, where we're obviously seeing the systemic breakdown of a lot of these cultural structures that have existed and have caused trauma just by virtue of their existence, whether it's intentional or not. And now we have this opportunity, especially with the proliferation of technology and information, for all of us to get educated and create something new. I think we're looking at a new model. I have no idea what it looks like, but I think it's going to be more decentralized than perhaps what we're used to.
Pretty sure that's needed.
I think that happens organically, though, through movements like this, to some degree. I was looking at statistics not too long ago, and I'm noticing that just like the amount of minority populations are going to supersede what would be considered the white male population in America in I mean, literally less than a generation, and never too late, never too early for that matter. But, same thing with this. Through the process of diversity and perspective in society, I think things stop becoming so centralized. What I appreciate everything you said, was the decriminalization over legalization. And is that for a reason? I'm sure it is, but what is the reason for that? Why is it decrim versus legalized?
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, thank you, Chris. That's a great question. Decriminalization first. I really anchor onto the decriminalized nature model, and they talk about grow, gather, gift, right? These are naturally occurring plants and fungi, and I believe personally that it's a fundamental human right to be able to use these plants and fungi to both heal and explore our consciousness. And so what decriminalization does in many ways, and I'll speak to Denver, is that it really evened the playing field, right? So in Denver, it was decriminalized. We went as close as we could to decriminalization as possible. So meaning that folks can, in Denver, you can use, possess, store, and cultivate psilocybin mushrooms, and there's no limits on personal amounts. In Denver, there's no sales for remuneration right now, and gifting is a gray area. But at the very least, anybody who lives within the city and county of Denver can cultivate their own mushrooms. And so decrim is important, so that it allows for individuals to have the choice, right? If they want to grow mushrooms, awesome. In other cities, like in Oakland, they're all entheogens were decriminalized, right? The challenge, though, is now we're looking at the sustainability conversation with entheogens, right? So mushrooms are very easy to create, whereas Banisteriopsis apsis capi, the ayahuasca vine, takes like 15 years to mature. Peyote cacti take longer, right? And so, I mean, there's this territory is so wide open right now, and the challenge we're seeing is like, how do we do this correctly and do this in a way that benefits people and doesn't, have a negative impact on, let's just say, on nature, right? And how do we do it correctly?
So, I'm going to pause. I appreciate that. It was very well said. This is something I'm nerding out on all day, every day, and like knocked it out of the park. Love it. I appreciate you, man. And
Yeah.
we're going to do some good things. We're going to keep this fight up. But, you know,
Yeah.
in this conversation, in the context of this topic and what we're going to be discussing here for the last few minutes, and the big, you know, changes that we're not seeing to these complexes and these institutions that are so dangerous and destructive. You know, I have noticed that all it takes here in Cambridge, in Boston, in Philadelphia, wherever, some cool people believing in the plant, believing in the medicine, going to the government, telling them, hey, do you mind decriminalizing this? Can we like change these laws? And they're like, man, you know what? Sounds good. It'll make me look good. People will talk about me. They'll mention us in the news. I saw it in Denver. I saw it in Oakland. And it's like blew my mind. I was like, oh my God, look how fast these institutions changed. Look how fast these laws changed. Every other law I want to see change. Everything I did as a part of Occupy, particularly, and last year, everything that I was staying up late, you know, pissed off about. Why are those institutional changes not happening? Why are those laws not able to get changed immediately, or in 6 months or in 12 months? Why is it taking 100 years? Like, I just don't get it. I mean, I don't know if you guys
how many people are
elaborate.
affected by this law, right? So I understand in Denver, you know, the ability and right to be able to grow things naturally is one thing, but how many people were actually incarcerated? Like, I'm comparing it to cannabis, and you know, there's a statistic that can tell you how many people of Black or Latino populations are incarcerated for cannabis, small cannabis crimes. Is it a big comparative in psychedelics?
No.
That's why it's easy to change.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's why, like, when I look at the cannabis legalization movement, and right now I see a lot of things talking about equity. And I noticed you talked about this. What upsets me about this is, you know, when you look at legalizing cannabis and the interest is to get people out of jail, whatever, there are far quicker ways through decriminalization, through staying sentences, to get people out of jail versus putting them through the pardon process to resolve their criminal background. You know how long and arduous and antiquated the pardon process is? And you know how hard that is to do inside of the legal system? So to get people out, as opposed to trying to fight a battle for legalization and focus on decriminalization, stop adding to the problem. I'm all in support of that. So I'm glad that that's the model that you focus on. Go ahead, Richard.
So Joe, like, you know, you're wearing the yellow vest. You know, there's some real serious systemic issues that are plaguing our people across this world. I know you know about them, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit on, like, why can't I just go and, you know, and politely ask my local representatives to, like, consider, you know, going through and making some institutional changes that'll make those troubles, I guess, lesser. I mean, maybe, I don't know. I'm not, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I understand. You can't move into somebody's house and then move around the furniture. What I mean by that is you just can't go in as somebody who is not part of that institution and automatically just say, hey, I want this and I want it now. Because as much as we want what we want when we want it, it doesn't necessarily work the same way when we're dealing with these behemoths that we call institutions. And part of the reason why is because the people in control of these institutions have, and Kevin, you weren't around when you weren't in the chat when I said this, but I said that institutions are based on our relationships. There's no connection between the people in charge of these institutions and the people outside of these institutions that want these institutions to change. And I've said this on some of my conversations and some of my chats that I've had in the past. I think there's a 4-step process that I think that needs to happen in order to change the way people relate and communicate with each other. I think what we need to do is we first find people that we don't normally speak with or we don't have any conversation or anything in common with. Secondly, we create some sort of common ground with the people that we are trying to have this newfound relationship or interconnectedness with. Next, we popularize the commonalities or the agreed upon principles that you and the other person have.
Love that. Break it down.
What we do is we then enforce the common ground with some sort of policy or some sort of rulemaking, or if it gets to the point where it's past rulemaking, law. So that's what I think needs to happen. And Kevin, as you so eloquently said earlier, it's a lot easier to make these connections with people in government when it involves a drug that is not necessarily as criminalized or stigmatized or, quite honestly, racially profiled. It's easier to look at a white guy and then people who are in control of government who are predominantly white, and you as a white guy can walk up and say, "Hey, Steve, what do you think about changing this mushroom law?" And I guarantee, or "Hey, why don't you knock down the penalty for a little bit of weed?" And I guarantee you, Steve in his college days is, tripped out on some LSD or smoked some weed or got a little bit too high.
Guaranteed.
I guarantee you he did. And so it's a lot easier to make those types of changes, especially when the person in charge of the institution sees themselves in the person that wants the change to happen. But when you look at somebody like me, that's like, well, yo, look, why don't you change these drug laws around? And then I'm going to a white guy to try to have this taken care of. It may not necessarily be the same type of relationship dynamic that needs to happen in order for these sorts of structural changes to make. So that is why I've said, so if we take this to racism, that's why I've said that we need white people involved in the fight with anti-racism work. Because for years, it's always been a situation where Black people have been trying to fight for these 4 fights that you will see on my t-shirt again: humanity, freedom, equality, and survival. White people are now dealing with those same 4 fights, but the context in which those 4 fights are occurring are slightly different, but they are fights nonetheless. And Kat and I, we've done an entire episode on this entire concept called intersectionality. And the sort of intersectionality in the struggle for humanity, freedom, equality, and survival must not only be metastasized on a local level or on a state level, but or a national level, but quite honestly, the fight must be internationalized, which is part of the reason why you see me wearing a yellow vest.
Intergalactic. I mean, we take it one step higher just to ensure the future, Joe. I'm with you on that. No, but I find it interesting. Kat, I want to hear, because I listened to your show when you were talking about something similar to this. I think it was a couple episodes back, and you made a lot of good points, but I'm going to see if it comes up right now. My bad, Richard.
Well, I was just going to ask Kat. I mean, I had written down here the idea of defunding the police. Police, big institution, defund the police, the big phrase that we've come across over the past year. I know, Kat, you feel strongly about that, so I figured maybe it might be a good time for you to kind of to reference that. So.
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly the direction I was thinking of going anyway. So first, I just wanted to thank Kevin for sharing your story. It's always a pleasure to hear people's story through this work and your journey. So yeah, one thing that came to mind when y'all were talking is the concept, the words that we're using is decriminalization. And when we're talking about these big institutions that seem so difficult to change, because they are, decriminalization is a way for us to make it so that there is an alternative already. Because if you're not criminalizing something, you don't need the justice system. So if you're decriminalizing something as simple as a plant, you don't need to be relying on a prison industrial complex to imprison people for that plant. And this can be, it goes back to the quote you actually said, Kevin, it can be widely applied because this is an alternative. We're saying, don't criminalize this, so we don't need this prison system. And it can be said for anything that we're trying to decriminalize as activists. I mean, sex work, it can be anything you can think of. We're trying to get the police to become obsolete by demonstrating community care from the ground up. And that's what grassroots movements are about. And of course, there are always changes that can come from above, which I think healthcare is a good example. Like those things need to come from above because those are social things that we can, we need a government or some sort of entity to widely provide that. But the rest, I feel like the rest is something that comes from community care, and it does come from the ground up. So hopefully that's a helpful comment.
What else can be bundled with this? You see, you brought up a great point, Kat. Like, there's so many things that probably shouldn't, but like if we were starting laws today, a new city, they would never be laws, right? Because we reflect on these things over society. A lot of these plant-based laws, I mean, they're just so
that sounds like
ridiculous.
A dream.
Right. But you see, the problem with this is when you make change, that means that somebody is held responsible for all the wrongdoing to this point. And sometimes that's completely justified. You look at the reparations argument and all these specific things. But then in this situation, the government looks at how many people are going to sue us for imprisoning them for last year having mushrooms in their pocket. Like they think about all of these reactionary things. Like if almost there was a day where there were several things in the plant movement. I'm talking about other things as well, such as it being illegal to grow plants in some front yards when people are just trying to put vegetable gardens in there. Like that seems pretty ideal versus grass, right? Talk about a win-win. But because some municipalities make these things illegal, that if we bundled some of these things together, where the psychedelic initiative is more or less, it's not thought about. People just want to go out and get high and trip or whatever kind of buzzword then the complex in the media puts against these things. And instead it's kind of bundled in with these laws are ridiculous in the first place, right? And they actually represent something far worse because it's the same thing that ultimately can put a law on you for something. Where are you going to start charging children for creating art, right? Because that's something that was naturally created by a child. Let's put a law on it. See, we can stop things by bundling them together. And I think people look at these arguments weird as it's a bunch of hippies trying to get high. And I think it's not about that at all. How do we solve that, Kevin?
So are you saying, sorry, Kevin, but
go ahead.
Are you saying, we could, as we're doing this work to decriminalize substances in this country, that could be, that maybe it would make sense for other movements and other changes that we want to have happen work together? Because I don't see that actually.
So like I've spent 3 terms in public office in Illinois, right? And I spent most of my life working in politics. And how the evil institution uses this is pork barrel funding, riders, right? So I'll add something on that gives me some cushy money in my district and I'll vote for your school board thing. But if you don't vote for my thing, that means I'm not voting for the school board funding. Like that's ridiculous. So schools get shut down on something unrelated. So if you basically make the argument almost matter of fact, right? Here's a whole bunch of things that not only save money, but also bring freedoms back together that all kind of live together in the same bucket. In this one, it's about, more or less freedoms and liberties as it pertains to plants, right? Decriminalize something that should be natural. And, it also falls into the thing that there's a lot of antiquated laws when it comes down to farming. For instance, in Chicago, you can't put any plants in the ground, right? And in the South Side, which is where all of the impoverished neighborhoods are, that's because they had these chemical spills years ago. So you plant something in the ground, they're still fearful of it. But I guarantee if they did a robust soil analysis somewhere, they'd find out that you probably can plant in the ground, but they don't want to spend money on that. So it's illegal, but it falls into the same category of natural nourishment and health. You bundle them together, it almost becomes unarguable in society that we live in today.
But I will just add really quickly that like these conversations feel really privileged too, because we're not necessarily talking about the implications of these things, because I mean, we brought it up earlier, like Black BIPOC folks, Black Indigenous people of color are horrendously represented in the prison industrial complex for plants, cannabis. That's what people go to jail for. And when we're decriminalizing these things, we can't divorce our conversations away from conversations of race, class, gender, etc.
I mean, those are a side effect. Of course, they're direct actions, but they're a side effect of some of the dumbest policies ever. And it just becomes a snowball effect of how much the side effect is getting out of control. So I think if we just remove some of these policies that automatically, like I just found out how many people get stuck in this debtor prison. They'll get a ticket for growing plants in their front yard or having a bag of mushrooms in a decriminalized environment where there's still a municipal ticket that can be written. And then it just gets put into the system. They never can get out of it. In some states, many states with minority populations, that's a jailable offense.
Yeah.
A jailable offense. You never get out of that system. So I want to eliminate that.
We're starting to see a little bit of progress, I think, in what you're talking about, Chris. And just for example, in California, a senator out there introduced a psychedelic decriminalization bill that did include sealing of records or expungements for previously incarcerated. And then, I'd love to see folks who are incarcerated for psychedelics out of jail if some kind of decrim passes in a municipality. And then also at the same time in Oregon last year, we had the psilocybin legalization for medical use. And then also at the same time, the statewide decriminalization of all drugs. Both those efforts were funded by the same groups. And so they were happening simultaneously because of that shared goal. And then maybe just the last thing here to share, what surprised me, one of the things that surprised me the most after we were successful in Denver and we started having these implementation meetings, I met with our director of safety. This guy's in charge of police, fire, EMS, all the first responders, this gentleman. And he said, Kevin, we're not worried about mushrooms unless the data starts to change, unless there's more crime related to it. What we're actually concerned about are the rising rates of individuals who are in Denver jails who need therapy and other forms of psychological assistance and not to be in jail. And they're like, how can you help us with that part of it? And so I think that that was amazing because it all of a sudden went from a psilocybin conversation to a more broader drug policy conversation and acknowledging that the prison system isn't doing anything to help individuals find relief or recover from their substance abuse, if it is substance abuse. So I would hope that we're going in that direction.
So yeah, I see your hand up there, Joe, and I just want to shout out Black People Trip on Instagram, doing some really awesome stuff, and it's really important that the communities and the people of color are put onto these medicines. It really is not happening much. But go ahead, Joe, and we're gonna after that we're gonna see how we can wrap this up.
Yeah, and I thank everybody for what everybody said here earlier. I think, again, this comes back to relationships. It comes back to personal motivation. It comes back to institutions that are behind these unequal and draconian laws. And if you take a look at what's happening in the United States right now regarding not just necessarily marijuana, but let's look at cocaine. Cocaine comes from the coca leaf. If you've ever been to Bogota, Colombia, you can drink coca leaf tea, and it helps deal with the adverse effects of high altitude. And they've somehow taken the coca leaf and made it into cocaine. But then people took cocaine and made it into crack. And if you take a look at the sentencing laws that were written in 1993, I think it was, for the crack bill. And the crack bill instituted mandatory minimum sentencing for possessing and or dealing crack. Cocaine, not nearly as harsh. If you take a look at the crime bill that was written, that disproportionately locked up generations of Black and brown people, and in most instances, those people who were incarcerated were put behind bars because of nonviolent drug offenses, mostly from crack and marijuana. If we take what I think also needs to happen, in addition to changing the laws, this also needs to be a change of the people in charge of these institutions. And part of the reason why I mentioned the crack bill and the crime bill, and we could talk about the Rave Act of 1993 also. We could talk about some of the stuff that Bill Clinton did. But right now we have a man in the White House who is a major architect of many of the inequalities that come from minor drug offenses and, quite honestly, racist policies and laws. And that's none other than Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., otherwise known as the President of the United States of America. I think he is wholly unqualified to be president. And I think much of what he's done over his nearly 50-year career in Washington has led to the inequalities and 5 like-minded, opinionated people on this chat, and many of us who are watching and many others who will watch this chat wondering how we got to this place in the first place. And the reason we got to this place in the first place is because of institutionalized racism. And again, if we want to change the institutions, we have to change not only the relationships we have with the institutions, but the people in charge of these institutions. And we can't necessarily change the people, their hearts, because people who have racism in themselves, we're just not going to get rid of it. There's no pill that you can say, hey, guess what? I'm not racist anymore. Yippee. But what you can do is change a racist policy, and you can change a racist law. Changing a racist law or racist policy is considerably easier and, quite honestly, more effective than changing a racist person's mind.
Do you think we'll see some some laws like that change this year, 2021, or are we going to see more of a discussion around it?
I think we'll see more of a discussion around it, but I don't think we'll see any sort of effective changes. And I think the major reason why we won't see any effective changes is because we're in the middle of a pandemic. And quite honestly, people are more willing to, or are more concerned about how they're paying rent and where their next $20 is coming from, and if they're going to have a roof over their head, as opposed to wondering if somebody in the south side of Chicago is going to get busted for drugs and is going to spend 12 years in jail as opposed to 18 months in jail. There's a big difference between the existential crisis that we are all dealing with right now, as opposed to the, as Barbara Ehrenreich said, being poor is one long emergency, and the long emergency that is the over-criminalization of drugs.
So I'm wondering if everybody could go around and this, maybe this is not the easiest thing to answer, but if an institution, if you could see an institutional change, a change in in an institution in the United States of America or in Canada occur tomorrow, what comes to mind, Chris?
I think that it's the relationship with the media and the country and everything. I think it would be in a perfect world if the media at the top of the article, right underneath their byline, just like we now have pronouns and everything that's common practice and accepted and encouraged, they're able to identify a bias, right? And to me, bias is not a bad thing. What's a bad thing is when people don't know that they have a bias. It's like in golf where there's a handicap, you put it out there, you even the playing field. So I support bias, but I support people acknowledging it and then also accepting that another person has a bias. And just by putting it up there in the media, that kind of interest and that transparency, I think it changes the game. And we start getting the media back towards where it needs to be. And a free media of the people that's not manipulated by bureaucracy. And of course, the financial institutions that run it all. That's what we need in America.
Now you're talking my language.
Yeah.
See what we can do. Kat?
Oh my gosh. That's a big ask, but you know what? We're about that here.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, all of what Chris just said, and probably what all of you all are going to say, and also just decriminalize anything that's nonviolent. Like, we need to be able to have freedom to do whatever, however we want, because I think communities know how to take care of themselves better than a large bureaucratic institution and these complexes that have been around. And I mean, really, when it comes down to it, I just want to, get rid of capitalism, but that's a whole other ask.
Damn, that's hot. It's intense. Sorry guys, I'm getting a little bit of a lag on my end. Can you still hear me? Okay, good. Yeah, everything got really pixelated. All right, Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah. Real quick question. Have any of you ever experimented with any shamanic breathing techniques to facilitate the endogenous production of DMT?
Sign me up.
Okay.
Sounds like something I might be interested in.
And it's relevant because and to answer your question, Rich, the education system. I think we got to start early. Like like I have a 6.5-year-old. We are not having him indoctrinated into public education. And I would love to see the education system change that puts a priority on emotional intelligence.
Let's go.
Puts a priority on, being connected with this vessel called the human body, which is really just a spaceship traveling through the quantum freaking universe, from my perspective. And also, like, teaching us how to financial, not just financial responsibility, but how to invest in things, or how to look at currency as energy, as a means to facilitate the whatever our goals are. So I think education, starting with our kids, right? And the reason why I in like meditation, and the reason why I brought up the whole endogenous DMT was because I had a crazy ayahuasca-esque experience last night in my meditation, and so I was just curious, and it just kind of it blew my head open, and it was very surprising and also a little bit scary. So there you go. Thank you.
Thank you. I love it. It's good to have you here this week, Kevin. We'll have to have you back, Mr. Nice. It's like your Reservoir Dog name. Is that a guy in Reservoir Dog, Mr. Nice?
I think that might be. I've said this before, and I'll continue to repeat it and beat the drum again on this. We need a cultural autopsy of all of the institutions that make up the United States society.
All of them.
It's a cultural autopsy. We need to look at these institutions, figure out what works, figure out what doesn't, do more of what does work, and stop doing what doesn't work. And Kevin, you mentioned something that's quite obvious and useful. You said the education system. And I find myself saying this when we do these chats, but I'll say it again. A few months ago, Cat Wells and I did an entire episode on the educational system, and I think it was called Schools, and it was an early episode. And in that episode, we basically talked about how ineffective the educational institution is, and what kids are learning in school now is quite honestly useless. And Kevin, when you mentioned emotional intelligence and that the human body is a vessel traveling through space and time, we talked about some of that, but some of the stuff that Kat and I talked about was maybe a bit more esoteric than meditation and spirituality. We want kids especially, when they go to an educational institution, otherwise known as a school, we want them to come out as better humans. We don't necessarily want them to be smart. We want them to be wise. Phones are smart. We want kids to become wise, and we want them to be wise to the ways of the world. How do you do that? We teach kids basic home repairs. We teach kids how to fix a flat tire. We teach kids how to grow their own food. We teach kids how to resolve conflict non-violently. We teach kids how to use their words and not their fists. We teach kids about basic sex education. We teach kids about pharmaceutical use. We teach kids yoga. You see what I'm saying? These are the kinds of subjects that we need to teach our children. That way, when our children become adults, they become better, well-rounded human beings, as opposed to the way schools are now, where schools seem to create Karens and Kevins, which are these, I don't mean necessarily Kevin, you don't mean it like that, but what I mean is Chads. That's it. Thank you. What I mean by that is you end up with with privileged white people that can use their whiteness to get whatever they want, and then the institution supports their racist behaviors. And what I mean that we need a cultural autopsy, it's that sort of deep dive, it's that sort of difficult line of questioning that needs to be undertaken. So not only does the educational system get reformed, but quite honestly, we get better human beings as a result of a reformation of the educational system.
Hard to deny that. It's hard to hear, but it's also hard to deny, I think.
Well, look, Ranch, you understand this. Sometimes, love comes in the form of sometimes having difficult conversations.
Oh yeah. My answer is it's kind of you guys touched on a lot of things that made me think of it. I mean, it does involve emotional intelligence. I'd like to see, and Chris, you mentioned it earlier, and you're right. I don't know if it's the way that we've been lobbying for it or shouting about it, but I'd like to see healthcare be universal, but particularly I'd like to see the institution of healthcare in relation to our government be the kind of thing that at the very least, I want to see all of our people have access to mental health, healthcare, particularly, and the ability to go in. If it's gotten that bad, if life is that intense, or the addiction is that bad, or I'd like to believe that we, at the very least, we can offer that. And I mean, it's not that easy. It involves money, but I mean, I have seen some crazy figures over the past year as to the very few individuals that are making astronomical money off of the pandemic itself, and just take a little bit off the top, plug it into mental health. We got it going on, I think. But I'm gonna wrap it up for this week, if that's all good with everybody. And this was episode 10, and it's been a honor and a privilege as always, everyone. And I'm gonna we'll say goodbye to my co-host here. I'm going to wrap it up with a short poem to end, as usual. And we'll be back in a month. So this is the second Tuesday of every month, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, Fear and Loving with Ranch and the squad. And I believe we'll be looking at some issues in the media next month. So thanks, everybody. Love you so much. All right, guys. So this poem's called The World. It's a short one. The world. Shadow is cast upon the tip of the wing by white fluorescent tail lights. The full moon shines off to the left slightly, illuminating clouds below. Far above the vast desert of clouds, we lean on the windows, waiting for the next break in the sky, and the stars are just so close. Celestial bodies made to expire, tragic but beautiful, just like us. There is a euphoria being this removed, a bliss through this perspective. This world is our heaven, our sacred space. Big love, guys. Fear and loving. Stay safe. Enjoy the sunshine if you got it. See you next month.